The morning of June 7th, 1944, dawned cold and gray over the hedge country of Normandy, France. A light drizzle fell across the ancient farmland, turning the narrow dirt roads into ribbons of mud. Somewhere in this labyrinth of stone walls and dense vegetation, tens of thousands of German soldiers were regrouping after the initial landings, preparing counterattacks that military strategists believed could push the invading forces back into the sea. The American paratroopers scattered across the countryside that morning had every reason to believe they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. What none of those soldiers on either side could have imagined was that the fate of thousands would soon rest not on artillery or armor, but on 300 meters of ordinary fishing line and the desperate ingenuity of a 38-year-old maintenance worker from Wisconsin who had never fired a weapon in anger before that week. The world remembers the storm of D-Day, June 6th. The world forgets the perilous calm of D-Day +1. The Allied foothold on Festung Europa was not a beachhead, but a series of isolated, feverish pulses. Pockets of paratroopers clinging to canal crossings, infantry regiments slowly inching their way off the sand, tank crews lost in a vertical maze of hedgerows they called the bocage. The German response, initially a chaotic symphony of conflicting orders and shattered communications, was beginning to find its rhythm. The Wehrmacht's formidable operational machine, creaking but lethal, was pivoting. Divisions like the 352nd Infantry and the 709th Static, bloodied but unbowed, were forming up. The 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, elite and furious, was moving into blocking positions. The plan was simple, brutal, and historically effective. A concentrated, heavy counterattack before the invaders could consolidate. To push them into the sea. Into this precarious seam of history fell Private First Class Thomas J. Harrigan, serial number 3648751, Company C, 1st Battalion, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. He was, by every measure, an accident on the battlefield. To understand the profound improbability of his impact, one must first feel the texture of the life he left behind. Green Bay, Wisconsin, 1941. The air smelled of thawing earth, cut grass, and the distant, pungent effluvium of the paper mills along the Fox River. Thomas Harrigan's world was one of calibrated routines and profound love. His wife, Margaret, had a laugh that could cut through the grayest Lake Michigan sky. But pneumonia, that banal thief, took her in the deep freeze of January 41, leaving Thomas with a void as vast as the lake in 3 anchors. Sarah, 12, serious and maternal beyond her years. David, 9, all scabbed knees and quiet intensity. And Emma, 6, whose nightmares he soothed with stories of friendly pike in the bay. His work at the Northern Paper Mill was not a job, but a kinetic puzzle, a universe of shuddering conveyor belts, hissing steam valves, and gigantic four-denier wires that needed a mechanic's intuitive touch. He was a man who solved problems with his hands, whose worth was measured in repaired bearings and the quiet satisfaction of a running machine. The draft noticed with a foreign object in this world, a grenade rolled across his kitchen table. At the local board, he stood, calloused hands holding his children's photographs, and spoke of hardship. The men behind the table, their faces etched with the grim arithmetic of global war, saw not a unique tragedy, but a statistic. Your mother can take them, Harrigan. Your country needs mechanics, too. Over there. The farewell at the station was a small, private agony. Emma's 2-hour crescendo of tears, wetting the wool of his uniform jacket. David's rigid, trembling attempt at a manly handshake. Sarah's silent, desperate hug, whispering, "You come back, Daddy. You promise." By 1:30 hours on June 6th, he was in the belly of a C-47 Skitran, vomiting from fear and air sickness, the plane bucking through flak that popped like malevolent black flowers in the sky. The green light flickered on amid shouted curses and the deafening roar of the slipstream. Then he was in the air, the static line yanking his chute open with a jarring crack, the sudden silence a heavier noise than the engine drone. Below, tracers laced the darkness, lazily at first, then with urgent speed. He drifted, a puppet on a string, over a landscape of shadow and sudden fire. He crashed through the canopy of an apple orchard near the village of Blossville, the branches tearing at his equipment, the ground rising to meet him with the indifferent force of a planet. The impact drove the air from his lungs. A searing, white-hot pain shot through his right ankle. He lay gasping, entangled in his lines, the smell of crushed apples and cordite in his nostrils. For 57 hours, Harrigan's universe was the corpse of a 17th-century Norman barn. He had crawled there, dragging his useless leg, as dawn broke on the 6th. The structure was a skeleton of mossy fieldstone and rotten oak beams, half-galanged under a sagging thatch roof. It offered the illusion of shelter. His training took over in a shallow, automatic way. He oriented his position. The barn faced south, towards a narrow dirt track. A rusted iron water pump stood in what was once a farmyard. To the west, the land rose into a thickly wooded ridge. The sounds were his map: the distant, constant thunder of naval guns from the coast, the sporadic, closer rattle of small arms fire, and most ominously, the growing frequency of guttural German voices and the grinding of heavy vehicles on the move. Through a crack between two stones, he became a scholar of the enemy. He saw not a faceless horde, but individuals. A young Gefreiter nervously smoking a cigarette, his helmet too large for his head. A veteran Feldwebel with a face like old leather, methodically checking the tracks on a Kubel wagon. Columns of infantry marching in that distinctive, rolling gait, their Mauser rifles slung, their expressions a mix of fatigue and determination. They were not monsters. They were men, a fact that made the situation more terrifying, not less. He ate his Duration chocolate and 2 packets of Charms candy, the sickly sweetness cloying. He sipped his water, making it last. His ankle morphed into a throbbing, purple monstrosity, the laces of his jump boot biting in his swollen flesh. Infection, he knew, was a slow, creeping enemy within. On the morning of June 7th, driven by a thirst that scratched his throat and the certain knowledge that a German patrol would eventually check the barn, he decided to move. The decision was clinical, born of despair. He prepared his kit with the meticulousness of a mechanic he was. His M1 Garand, 8 rounds in the end-block clip. He had never fired it at a human being. The manual of arms felt abstract now. 5 MK, 2 fragmentation grenades, their cast-iron bodies serrated from maximum shrapnel. He hefted one. It weighed exactly 1.36 pounds, a cold, dense potential. His M3 trench knife. A first-aid pouch, useless for his ankle. And his pack. In the bottom of the pack, beneath the cherished, crumpled letters from home, Sarah's neat script describing David's fight with the Johnson boy, a smudged pencil drawing from Emma of their house, with a giant, smiling sun. His fingers found it. A spool of fishing line. Shakespeare brand. Monofilament. 20-kilo test. 300 meters. He had packed it almost as a talisman, a piece of his peaceful self. He'd imagined a quiet stream, a flick of the wrist, the meditative weight. Now in the damp gloom, it felt like a cosmic joke. He was starving, crippled, and hunted, holding a tool for leisure. He peered out from the barn's broken doorway. The pre-dawn murk was giving way to a flat, gray light. And then he saw them. Less than 200 meters to the east, the land dipped into a classic Norman Chemin-Creux. A sunken lane, so ancient its bed was a full 3 meters below the surrounding fields, worn down by a millennium of peasant carts and winter runoff. It was a perfect natural defile, and it was teeming with the machinery of war. Harrigan's mechanics, I automatically cataloged the assets. At least 40 Opel Blitz 3.6-ton trucks, their canvas tops flapping, engines idling in a low diesel rumble. A dozen BMW R75 and Zundap KS 750 motorcycle combinations, their machine gun-mounted sidecars pointing outward like the antennae of insects. 3 SD, KFZ, 231 8-wheeled armored cars, their long 20mm KWK, 30 cannon sweeping slowly. 2 squat, deadly Sturmgeschütz, 3 assault guns, their 75 millimeters stubby barrels ominous. And men, a battalion's worth. He estimated over 800 infantry from the Panzergrenadier uniforms, plus support crews. They were forming up. Feldwebels barked orders. Officers clustered around map boards. It was not a defensive position. It was a launch point. A cold clarity washed over him, colder than the Normandy drizzle. This force, if it moved west, would hit the scattered, disorganized elements of the 101st and the 82nd like a sledgehammer. It could punch through to the beaches. The entire delicate, blood-soaked enterprise of Overlord could collapse in a sector. He thought of the other lost boys in the hedgerows, boys who'd shared cigarettes on the troop ship, boys with their own Sarahs and Davids and Emmis. He thought of his promise. His gaze shifted from the military tableau to the Chemin Creux itself. The lane was a perfect bottleneck. The embankments were steep, near vertical in places, choked with hawthorn, blackberry brambles, and ancient, gnarled oaks whose roots snaked through the soil like bones. The road itself was barely 3 meters wide, just enough for 2 vehicles to scrape past. If that column entered the lane, it would become a serpent in a tube, unable to deploy, unable to retreat easily. Then he looked at the spool in his hand. The monofilament was almost invisible against the gray light. An idea, born not of tactical genius, but of a mechanic's understanding of leverage, tension, and cause and effect, ignited in his mind. It was absurd. It was the only thing he had. He would not fight them. He would stage a fight for them. The next 2 hours were an epic of pain and focused precision. Every movement was fire. Using his rifle as a crutch, he low-crawled along the eastern embankment, hidden in the thick brush. His world shrank to the texture of bark, the pull of a line, the geometry of traps. He started with the tripwires. Using a sailor's bowline and a series of slip knots he'd learned for tying down cargo nets, he strung the filament across the lane at varying heights. Ankle-high lines, tied to sturdy hazel saplings for the infantry. Bumper height lines, he estimated the Opal's front axle at roughly 70 centimeters for the vehicles. He created a web, not a single barrier. The lines were spaced irregularly, 10 meters apart, then 5, then 15, to mimic the randomness of a deliberate ambush, not a single obstacle. Then came the grenades. This required an engineer's calm. He chose 5 robust oak trees, each about 5 meters up the embankment from the road, spaced at intervals along the lane's first 200-meter stretch. From each grenade, he carefully unwound the safety pin just enough to loosen it, but not enough for it to fall out. He then used a thinner strand of the monofilament, doubled for strength, to create a lasso around the pin's ring. He secured the grenade firmly in a fork of the tree, spoon facing outward. The main trip line from the road was then tied to this lasso with a tension knot. The physics were terrifyingly simple. A vehicle snags the trip line, applies 20 to 30 pounds of pull, the lasso tightens and yanks the pin free, the spoon flies, and 4 seconds later, high explosive detonation in a confined space. But Harrigan thought in layers, like a machinist facing a complex repair. A simple explosion might cause a pause. He needed a narrative. At the far eastern exit of the lane, where it climbed out into an open field of wheat, he used his remaining line for psychological warfare. He tied multiple strands to several large, dead elm branches he'd laboriously hauled to the embankment's lip. The lines ran down to low tripwires across the road exit. The idea was not to destroy, but to suggest. A convoy hitting a tripwire here would see a cascade of timber tumble across their path, a seemingly deliberate roadblock, implying the enemy was ahead, sealing them in. By 9:45, drenched in cold sweat and trembling from agony, he was finished. He had created a 500-meter-long instrument of delayed chaos. He hauled himself back to a shallow depression on the ridge, overlooking the mouth of the lane. He had 8 rounds, a knife, and a prayer. He was the playwright, and the audience of 800 was about to arrive. The performance began at 10:15. With a roar of engines, the column lurched forward. The lead elements, a BMW R75 combination followed by an SD, KFZ, 231, nosed cautiously into the mouth of the Chemin. Then the trucks rolled in, packed with Panzer Grenadiers. The sound became a physical presence, the deep-throated diesel cacophony, the clatter of tracks and wheels on stone, the shouted commands. The lane filled like a clogging artery. Harrigan watched, his mouth dry, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was no longer a soldier. He was a stage manager waiting for the first cue. The BMW's sidecar wheel hit the first ankle-high line at 10:23. Harrigan saw the filament go taut, a momentary gleam like a spider's thread in the mist. The motorcycle jerked, the driver cursing as he fought the handlebars. The tension traveled up the embankment, transmitted through the complex web of lines. Ping! A soft, almost musical sound, unheard in the engine roar. The pin of the first grenade, positioned 30 meters into the lane, popped free. 1001. The grenade spoon spun away. 1002. The Panzer Grenadiers in the nearest truck were looking at the struggling motorcycle. 1003. The Feldwebel in the armored car turret stood up, peering forward. 1004. The world exploded. The Mk2 grenade contained 2 ounces of TNT. In the open, its lethal radius was 5 meters. In the stone and earth canyon of the Chemin, the blast was channeled, reflected, and magnified. The concussion was a physical wall. The BMW disintegrated, shrapnel scything into the troops in the following truck. The armored car's commander was thrown from his hatch. A chorus of screams and shouts in German erupted, raw and panicked. Chaos, the true weapon, was unleashed. The driver of the second truck, instinct taking over, slammed his brakes and swerved left. His front fender caught a second bumper height line. Ping! Another grenade, 60 meters down the lane, this one nestled in the roots of a massive oak. Its detonation was earthier, a crump that heaved mud and stone into the air. The truck's windshield vanished. Men began boiling out of the vehicles, seeking cover that didn't exist on the narrow road. In their panic, they scrambled up the embankments, blundering into more lines. Ping! Ping! 2 more grenades detonated in quick succession. One near the middle of the column sent a truck lurching on its side, spilling soldiers like toys. The other, near the rear, created a firewall of smoke and debris. The 5th grenade, triggered by a squad leader stumbling through a bramble patch, exploded near the exit, bringing the dead elm branches crashing down in a convincing, dusty avalanche. In under 90 seconds, Harrigan's symphony of tension was complete. But the music had only just begun. The German battalion did not experience this as a series of unlucky accidents. They experienced it as a textbook airborne ambush. Multiple simultaneous explosions along the column's length check, obscured lines of sight check, apparent blocking of the exit check, and no visible enemy. The most terrifying check of all. The assumption was logical and immediate. They were in a Hinterhalt, a kill zone, set by a significant force of Fallschirmjäger in the impenetrable hedgerows. The battalion commander, a Major Halder, reacted with professional competence that played directly into Harrigan's hands. He ordered the column halted and the unit to deploy defensively. The order, passed by runner and frantic radio call, transformed the mobile battalion into a static fortress. Machine gun teams, MG-42s, the Hitler's buzzsaw, were set up on the embankments, hosing the opposite tree lines with long, terrifying bursts that shredded leaves and tore bark but hit no one. Mortar crews scrambled to set up their Granatwerfer 34 tubes in the ditches, firing blind, pre-planned defensive barges into the fields beyond. Scouts were sent out in fire teams. They returned, puzzled and nervous, reporting Kane feigned contact. No enemy contact. This absence was more alarming than contact. It suggested a disciplined, patient enemy. For 3 hours, the mighty Kampfgruppe remained coiled in the ditch. Engineers were brought forward to clear the minefield. They moved with agonizing slowness, probing for non-existent pressure plates, cutting the nearly invisible fishing lines with baffled exclamations. Each cut line was treated as a booby-trap disarmament. The blocked exit required a vehicle to winch the branches clear, a process done under the presumed eyes of unseen snipers. The radio traffic from Major Halter's command vehicle was a cascade of escalating concern. Messages flew to regimental headquarters, under heavy ambush by elite paratrooper forces in strength. Significant casualties, road blocked with expertly laid obstacles and explosives. Request reinforcement and air support if possible. This intelligence, intercepted and amplified up the chain, created a strategic phantom. At Division HQ, the map now showed a substantial Allied penetration in a sector believed to be secure. The planned coordinated counterattack, of which Halter's battalion was the spearhead, was postponed. Wir müssen erst unseren Rücken säubern, the division commander declared. We must clean our rear first. Reserve companies were diverted. Artillery schedules were scrubbed. A window of opportunity, hinging on speed and violence, swung gently shut. Thomas Harrigan saw none of this. He saw only the trapped column, the frantic activity, the smoke hanging low in the Chemin-Creux. As German engineers finally cleared the last of his branches in the early afternoon, he knew his role was over. He was a spent force. Using his rifle as a crutch, he began an agonizing, mile-long crawl east, away from the sound of engines finally restarting. He collapsed in a rain-swollen ditch, his uniform caked in mud, his consciousness fading. A patrol from the 2nd Battalion, 506th, found him the next morning. He was muttering about fishing line and pins. They thought he was shell-shocked. He awoke to the sterile smell of bleach and the murmur of voices in a field hospital tent. His ankle was in a cast. A captain with intelligent, tired eyes sat by his cot. "I'm Captain Morrison, G2. Private, we need to talk about a sunken road near Blossville." Under Morrison's patient questioning, the story emerged fragment by fragment. The spool, the knots, the grenades in the trees. Morrison's skepticism warred with the hard data he possessed. The intercepted German signals, the prisoner interrogations describing a devilish ambush, the inexplicable 6-hour delay of a critical battalion. 2 weeks later, Morrison returned with a bird colonel from division. The intelligence was now concrete. By cross-referencing Harrigan's account with German unit logs and timings, they concluded his actions had directly impacted the movement of Kampfgruppe Halter, causing a cascade delay that stalled the divisional counterattack for a critical window. "You bought time, son," the colonel said, his voice gravelly. "In this business, time is blood. You saved a lot of our boys' blood." He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He was also going home. Osteomyelitis had set into the ankle bone. The day before his evacuation, Captain Morrison visited him one last time. He handed Harrigan a small brown package. Inside was a new spool of Shakespeare monofilament 20-kilo test. A note, signed by several members of the 506th, read, "For the best damn fisherman in the 101st. Hook a big one for us back in Wisconsin." Thomas Harrigan returned to Green Bay in late August 1944. He walked with a permanent, rolling limp. He went back to the paper mill, now working as a foreman, his mechanic's mind solving different puzzles. He raised his children, attended their weddings, bounced grandchildren on his knee. The spool of lines sat on his dresser, the plastic slowly yellowing. He almost never spoke of Normandy. The memory was a complex knot of pride, horror, and a profound sense of dislocation. He had done a violent, clever thing, but he was not a violent man. He had saved lives, but he had taken them. The weight was private. In 1968, his son David, a helicopter crew chief in the Mekong Delta, wrote a letter home. It was filled with the frustration of a small cog in a vast, indifferent machine. "Nothing I do here matters, Pop. It just doesn't connect to anything big." That letter broke the dam. Thomas Harrigan sat at his kitchen table, the Wisconsin night quiet outside, and wrote back. He wrote for pages. He described the smell of the barn, the taste of his fear, the texture of the fishing line against his fingers. He detailed every knot, every calculation, the sound of the pins pinging. He confessed the absurdity of it all. "You asked if what you do matters," he wrote. "I was one man with a spool of line against an army. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just trying to do something." to matter in that one place at that one time. And son, it rippled. It rippled in ways I couldn't see for years. You never know what your moment is or what you'll have in your hands when it comes. All you can do is use what you've got as best you can. That's how history gets made, David. Not just by generals, by mechanics, by fishermen. David kept that letter. After Thomas's death in 1985, it and the original spool were donated to the National World War II Museum. The story, once a whispered anecdote in 101st reunion halls, began to circulate. A French historian, combing through the captured war diary of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, found a frustrated entry for June 7th. Advance of 3 battalion delayed for over 6 hours due to extremely effective, simple booby traps and the belief in a large-scale enemy presence. Morale impacted. Timing for counterstroke lost. The Chemin is still there, a green, peaceful tunnel. A small, weathered plaque installed in 1992 reads, "Here, on June 7th, 1944, elements of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division delayed a German counterattack, contributing to the consolidation of the Allied beachhead." It does not mention fishing line. But those who know, the few remaining veterans, the curious historians, the families of the men who fought in those hedgerows, sometimes leave a small, symbolic offering, a fishing fly, a cork bobber, a modern spool of monofilament. They are tributes to the absurd, the improvisational, and the profoundly human element in war. For Thomas Harrigan's story is the ultimate testament to the unpredictability of history. It demonstrates that in the calculus of conflict, alongside mass and velocity, there exists a variable for creativity, the ability to see the world not just as it is, but as it could be repurposed. It is about the moment when a tool of peace becomes an instrument of war, when a man's love for his home becomes his strength on a foreign field, and when 300 meters of simple filament, strung with a father's desperate hope, can weave itself into the very fabric of history, holding back the tide for one crucial, impossible moment.